Hey guys, welcome to the Boring History channel. Do subscribe if you're a true history lover and want our content to reach you daily. Also, comment where you're watching from and at what time, and suggest any history topic you'd like us to post. We'd love to grow this community together. Dim your lights, and let's dive into an interesting medieval topic tonight. In the medieval world, work was not defined by imagination or prestige, but by survival, superstition, and social necessity. And as a result, many real occupations sound so bizarre today that they feel fictional, yet they were absolutely essential to daily life. Cities and villages functioned without modern sanitation, medicine, or technology, which created jobs that modern society no longer needs or openly acknowledges. One such profession was the gong farmer, a man hired to climb into cesspits and latrines under cover of night to shovel out human waste by hand. Often waste deep in filth, breathing toxic fumes that could kill instantly. Despite the danger and social disgust, gong farmers were paid well because no one else would do the job, and entire towns depended on them to prevent deadly disease outbreaks. Equally unsettling was the rat catcher, who was not merely a pest controller, but a crucial public health worker at a time when rats spread plague and famine. These individuals used traps, poisons, ferrets, and even bare hands, and some were believed to possess secret charms or magical knowledge to control vermin. In a world dominated by superstition, leech collectors were another strange but respected profession, as medical theory revolved around balancing bodily humours, and leeches were thought to cure everything from headaches to madness. Collectors waded into marshes or used their own legs as bait, allowing leeches to latch on before scraping them off for physicians. Even more disturbing was the role of the executioner, who was not only responsible for carrying out punishments but also for torture, body disposal, and sometimes medical procedures like amputations. Since their familiarity with anatomy made them oddly qualified, executioners were feared and shunned, forced to live on the edges of towns. Yet they were indispensable to law and order. At royal courts, the groom of the stool held one of the most intimate positions imaginable, assisting monarchs with their toilet needs and managing hygiene, a role that paradoxically granted immense political influence due to constant access to the ruler. Death itself created employment, such as the sin eater, a person hired to consume bread or drink placed on a corpse, to symbolically absorb the deceased's sins, allowing their soul to pass peacefully. Sin eaters were both needed and ostracized, believed to carry the spiritual corruption of entire communities. In marketplaces and noble households, professional mourners were employed to cry loudly at funerals, as visible grief was seen as a sign of honor and social status, turning sorrow into a performative occupation. Medieval medicine also relied on urine testers, who diagnosed illness by tasting or smelling urine, believing sweetness indicated disease, a practice that sounds absurd now, but was grounded in the limited scientific understanding of the time. Another odd role was the ale taster, who ensured beer quality by pouring it on benches and sitting in it to see if it stuck. Since sticky residue meant improper brewing, this mattered deeply, as ale was safer to drink than water and a staple of everyday nutrition. Children and adults alike could find themselves employed as human alarm clocks, known as knocker-uppers, who walked the streets tapping windows with long sticks to wake workers before sunrise, a job requiring precision, trust, and endurance in all weather. Animal-related professions were equally strange, including bear leaders who travelled with performing bears for entertainment, and goose herders who guided flocks through streets and rivers, supplying feathers, meat, and fat. Even warfare created peculiar roles, such as shield bearers, whose sole task was to protect knights during vulnerable moments, or corpse collectors, who followed battles to strip armor and valuables from the dead, blurring the line between necessity and moral taboo. Religious life also spawned unusual labor, including relic hunters who searched for holy bones and objects, sometimes fabricating them to meet demand, and bell ringers whose work was believed to drive away storms, demons, and disease. What makes these jobs sound made up is not just their strangeness, but how normalized they were within medieval society. People did not question their existence because life itself was harsh, short, and unpredictable, and every unpleasant task still had to be done by someone. These professions reveal a world where survival outweighed dignity, where superstition guided medicine, and where social order depended on invisible labor that history rarely celebrates. When viewed together, medieval jobs form a portrait of humanity adapting creatively, sometimes desperately, to its environment, reminding us that progress did not erase these roles overnight, but slowly replace them with sanitation, science, and technology. The fact that such occupations once supported families, earned wages, and defined identities proves that reality can be stranger than fiction, and that the medieval world, far from being simple or primitive, was complex, functional, and deeply human in its willingness to turn even the most uncomfortable necessities into real working professions. Beyond the better known oddities, medieval society was filled with even more occupations that feel invented yet were entirely real responses to the anxieties and limitations of the age. There were corpse watchers whose duty was to sit with bodies overnight, to ensure the dead did not rise, were not stolen for dissection, or were not prematurely buried. A genuine fear in an era without reliable methods to confirm death. Some towns employed night soil men who transported human waste outside city walls using carts, working silently before dawn to avoid public outrage, while others relied on tosha, like figures who scavenged drains, riverbanks, and sewers for coins, metal, or anything valuable that could be resolved. In castles and manors, far from the glamour often imagined, servants known as grooms of the chamber managed fleas, lice, and bedbugs, burning herbs and manually removing parasites from bedding and clothing. The fear of poison created another unusual role. Food tasters who risked death daily to ensure meals were safe, making loyalty a matter of life and death. In religious communities, anchorites voluntarily sealed themselves into small cells attached to churches, effectively becoming living spiritual monuments. While not a job in the modern sense, communities supported them because their prayers were believed to protect the town, turning isolation into a form of labor. Animal management produced strange specialists too, like wolf hunters hired by villages to track and kill wolves that threatened livestock and children, or dog whippers in churches, whose task was to beat stray dogs out of worship spaces to maintain order during services. Fear and entertainment blended in roles like the jester, who was allowed to mock nobles and kings openly, using humor as a political safety valve, and whose survival depended on wit sharp enough to entertain, but not offend too deeply. Disease created grim employment for plague buriers and searchers, people tasked with identifying infected homes, marking doors, and removing bodies, often at great personal risk, and sometimes forced into the role against their will. There were also resurrectionists, operating in moral grey areas, who stole fresh corpses from graves to supply medical schools long before legal anatomy donations existed. Even sound had its specialists, town criers who memorized laws, announcements and punishments, and shouted them in public spaces, acting as living newspapers in largely illiterate populations. In agriculture, stone pickers cleared fields by hand year after year, while scarecrow makers crafted human, like figures infused with superstition to frighten birds and evil spirits alike. Medieval beauty standards supported odd roles too, such as hair-gatherers who collected human hair to make wigs or padding for clothing, often from barbershops or refuse piles. Child labour produced positions like powder monkeys, early equivalents, young boys tasked with carrying messages or supplies in dangerous conditions simply because they were small and expendable. Even weather was treated as something that could be managed through labour, with charmers and weather wardens paid to perform rituals believed to prevent storms or bring rain. These jobs existed not because people were ignorant, but because medieval life demanded solutions using whatever beliefs, tools, and social structures were available at the time. Each strange occupation reflects a practical response to fear. Fear of death, disease, hunger, disorder, and divine punishment, and shows how communities distributed those fears into roles someone had to accept. When viewed through this lens, medieval work becomes less about absurdity and more about resilience, revealing a society that survived centuries of hardship by turning even the most uncomfortable, dangerous, or humiliating necessities into recognized organized labor, proving once again that history often feels unbelievable, not because it is false, but because it was lived under conditions modern minds can barely imagine. Even deeper beneath the surface of medieval life were occupations so specific and situational that they existed only because everyday survival depended on them, no matter how uncomfortable or humiliating they seemed. There were mudlarks long before industrial cities, people who combed riverbanks at low tide, searching for scraps of metal, lost tools, or discarded food, turning refuse into income in societies where nothing could be wasted. In towns built largely of wood, fire watchers were employed to patrol streets at night, listening and smelling for signs of smoke, knowing that a single unattended flame could erase an entire community by morning. Similarly, candle snuffers worked inside churches and halls, trimming wicks constantly to prevent dripping wax or fire hazards, a task requiring patience and constant attention. Medieval hygiene, limited as it was, created jobs like bathhouse attendants who managed communal baths, regulated water temperature, and sometimes discreetly facilitated services that blurred into prostitution, since cleanliness and morality were not always clearly separated. The fear of curses and witchcraft produced professional charm breakers, individuals believed capable of undoing hexes through rituals, herbs, or prayers, often consulted secretly by otherwise devout Christians. In noble households, lice pickers were employed to groom aristocrats, carefully removing parasites from hair and clothing, a job that sounds degrading today, but was essential in an age before effective pest control. Even smell had its specialists, with perfumers creating strong herbal scents to mask the odors of crowded cities, unwashed bodies, and animal waste, turning fragrance into a necessity rather than a luxury. Punishment systems required assistance to torturers, whose job was not only to restrain victims, but to maintain instruments, record confessions, and ensure procedures followed legal guidelines, making cruelty bureaucratic and routine. On the fringes of society, beggar kings or overseers organized groups of beggars, assigning territories and controlling profits, transforming poverty into a structured occupation. Maritime life created equally strange roles, such as ship's boys tasked with killing rats aboard vessels or cleaning bilges filled with foul water, while lighthouse keepers in primitive towers burned fires constantly, risking blindness or suffocation to guide ships safely. In rural areas, shepherds' assistants known as lookers guarded flocks overnight, fighting off thieves and predators armed with little more than sticks and dogs. Even silence could be a job, as monasteries relied on sign language interpreters who translated gestures for communication during vows of silence. In universities, beadles enforced discipline, physically dragging unruly students to punishment or fines, while manuscript rubbers erased ink from parchment so texts could be reused, a task that required delicacy to avoid destroying expensive writing surfaces. The dead continued to generate labour through grave tenders, who repaired collapsed burial sites, deterred grave robbers, and managed overcrowded churchyards where bodies were stacked or rotated. Entertainment for the masses relied on bear baiters, cockfighters, and travelling freak show handlers, whose livelihoods depended on spectacles modern audiences would find cruel or disturbing. Even architecture produced niche workers like gargoyle carvers who believed grotesque faces warded off evil, blending craftsmanship with superstition. What unites all these occupations is not how strange they appear today, but how rational they were within their context, each solving a problem created by overcrowding, ignorance, belief, or fear. Medieval society functioned because people accepted roles others avoided, absorbing danger, disgust, and social exclusion, so that the broader community could survive. These jobs remind us that progress did not simply improve comfort, but eliminated entire categories of labour built around suffering and risk. When we read about medieval work, the shock comes not from exaggeration, but from recognition that real people woke every day knowing their task was unpleasant, dangerous, or stigmatized. Yet they performed it anyway because the world they inhabited required it, and because someone always had to do the job, no matter how unbelievable it sounds centuries later. Still more layers of medieval labour emerge when we look at how closely work was tied to fear, control, and belief. Some towns employed official spies and informers whose task was to listen in taverns, markets, and churches for seditious talk, heresy, or insults against nobles, turning everyday conversation into a source of danger and employment. Alongside them were confession listeners outside formal religious roles, unofficial figures who claimed to interpret guilt and divine signs, often exploited by authorities to identify troublemakers. Law enforcement itself created strange professions such as jail keepers, who were paid not by salary, but by fees extracted from prisoners for food, chains, bedding, or even removal of shackles, making imprisonment a business rather than a sentence. In the same system existed dungeon cleaners who removed waste, blood, and decomposing matter from cells, a task so vile that it permanently marked those who performed it. Markets depended on official weighers and measurers, whose job was to ensure fairness. Yet corruption was so common that entire careers formed around manipulating scales while appearing legitimate. In religious festivals, flagellants whipped themselves publicly as an act of penance, and some were sponsored or supported by communities who believed their suffering could avert divine wrath, turning pain into a social service. Childhood was not spared from strange labour either. Children were used as chimney climbers in narrow flues or sent into wells and tunnels, because their small bodies fit where adults could not, normalizing danger from an early age. In noble courts, whisperers and rumor bearers were unofficial but powerful figures, paid or protected for spreading carefully crafted gossip to influence marriages, alliances, or rivalries. Military logistics created equally odd roles, such as camp followers who cooked, cleaned, laundered, scavenged, and provided companionship, forming moving cities behind armies and making war itself an employer. The handling of animals produced niche tasks like hoof trimmers for horses, pig drivers who moved livestock through crowded streets, and knackers assistants who processed dead or diseased animals for hides and fat. Occupations avoided due to smell and stigma. Water management demanded ditchers and dike wardens who inspected embankments daily, knowing that a single breach could flood entire villages and starve populations. Even timekeeping generated work, as bell wardens rang bells at precise intervals to regulate prayer, labour, and curfews, structuring life long before clocks were common. In castles, arrow fetchers followed archers during training and battle, collecting reusable arrows under constant risk, while armor polishers spent endless hours removing rust and blood to maintain both function and status. The obsession with purity created washerwomen, who cleaned clothes by beating them against stones in freezing rivers, and fullers who stomped cloth in vats of urine to clean and thicken fabric, an essential but deeply unpleasant step in textile production. Social exclusion itself became labour, with lepers sometimes forced to beg as an officially recognised role, ringing bells to warn others of their presence while surviving on alms. Even silence and darkness were managed through work, with night watchmen patrolling streets, calling out the hours, checking doors, and enforcing curfews in cities where crime, fire, and unrest thrived after sunset. Each of these occupations existed because medieval life offered no alternatives, no automation, and little protection, meaning every risk and inconvenience was absorbed by human bodies. What makes these jobs feel unreal today is not their rarity but their raw honesty. They expose a world where survival required turning fear, filth, pain, and belief into structured roles that kept society functioning. The medieval economy was not romantic or simple but brutally practical, relying on people willing or forced to do what others could not stomach. And in doing so, it reveals a truth that feels unsettling even now. History was built not only by kings and warriors, but by countless individuals whose strange, forgotten jobs held civilization together, one exhausting, dangerous day at a time. Even at the margins of daily life, medieval society kept inventing roles to manage fear, waste, belief, and power, creating occupations that feel surreal only because modern systems have erased the need for them. Some towns employed official silence keepers whose task was to enforce quiet during night hours by fining or physically punishing those who sang, argued, or worked too loudly, reflecting how fragile sleep and order were in crowded wooden cities. Alongside them were curfew enforcers who locked city gates at sunset and controlled who entered or exited, effectively holding the rhythm of urban life in their hands. The obsession with purity and morality produced bathhouse inspectors who monitored behavior in public baths, ensuring segregation by class or gender, and preventing activities considered sinful, though corruption often turned this role into quiet profiteering. Even bodily functions were regulated through work, with urine collectors gathering waste from households to sell to tanners and fullers, turning human byproducts into industrial resources. In the countryside, boundary walkers memorized village borders by physically walking them each year, sometimes beating children at landmarks, so they would remember property lines for life, embedding geography into pain. Even beyond all this, medieval life kept generating work wherever uncertainty existed, turning instability itself into employment. Some villages relied on official watchers of strangers, people tasked with tracking outsiders who entered town, noting where they slept, who they spoke to, and how long they stayed, because fear of spies, thieves, or plague carriers was constant. In the same spirit, road wardens patrolled dangerous stretches of highways, not to prevent crime but to recover bodies, mark hazards, and sometimes negotiate with bandits to ensure limited safety for merchants. Inns employed bed testers, whose grim task was to check mattresses for vermin, rot, or hidden weapons left by previous guests, often discovering infestations with their own skin. In large households, breath testers discreetly checked servants for signs of illness or drunkenness, as a sick worker could threaten the entire household. The medieval obsession with signs from God created lightning markers, who recorded where lightning struck, believing such places were cursed or sacred and required ritual cleansing. In farming communities, mole catchers tracked underground tunnels by sound and vibration, collapsing burrows by hand to protect crops, while crow scarers stood motionless for hours, shouting or waving to protect fields before mechanical scarecrows became common. Even roads produced strange labour, with stone feelers walking barefoot to detect loose cobbles that could break carts or horses' legs. In ports, smell judges evaluated fish and meat by scent alone to decide if they could legally be sold, a job requiring experience and strong stomachs. Warfare extended employment into darkness, with night scavengers sent after battles to search for wounded survivors, crying out in the dark, deciding who could be saved and who would be stripped and left. Castles employed draft blockers, who stuffed cloth and straw into cracks to keep out wind, pests, and spirits, as cold and superstition were equally feared. In courts of law, memory men were hired to recall past rulings and customs in societies where laws were unwritten, making human memory a legal archive. Seasonal festivals created temporary jobs like fire jumpers, who tested bonfires for safety before celebrations, risking burns so rituals could proceed. Even animals' deaths were managed by ritual butchers who followed specific prayers, and cuts believed to prevent bad luck. The fear of invisibility and neglect created census callers who walked door to door counting households for taxation and conscription, often attacked by residents desperate to remain unseen. In cities plagued by echoing noise, hornblowers signalled danger, fire, or invasion at different pitches, training their lungs to act as alarms. Wealth generated its own odd needs, including jewel breathers who gently fogged gemstones to detect cracks, and coin cleaners who polished currency to restore trust in trade. Childhood again bore danger through messenger children sent into riot zones, because they were less likely to be killed than adults. In monasteries and hospitals, candle watchers sat awake all night ensuring flames never died, believing darkness invited demons and despair. Even despair itself created work, with comfort speakers hired to talk to prisoners before execution, ensuring calm and compliance rather than resistance. These roles existed because medieval life had no margin for error. Every risk, fear, or inconvenience demanded a human solution. What makes these jobs sound unbelievable today is how directly they expose the mechanics of survival. revealing a world where nothing was automated, nothing was hidden, and every necessity rested on someone's endurance. Medieval society functioned not through efficiency, but through relentless human effort, assigning flesh and bone to every problem until life, however harsh, could continue for one more uncertain day. Even still, the medieval world found ways to turn the smallest anxieties into structured labor, creating occupations that existed only because uncertainty ruled everyday life. Some towns employed official door knockers whose task was to wake households before inspections, executions, or forced gatherings, ensuring no one could later claim ignorance. Alongside them were window counters, who assessed homes for taxation by counting visible openings, prompting families to brick up windows and creating a strange cycle where avoidance and enforcement fed each other. In markets, breath warmers stood near stalls in winter to keep hands functional for sellers handling metal or coin, their presence valued simply because numb fingers meant lost trade. Fear of moral decay produced public decency monitors who watched streets for improper behavior, particularly among women and youths, reporting infractions that could lead to punishment or shame. In castles, echo listeners stood in corridors at night, trained to recognize unfamiliar footsteps by sound alone, acting as living security systems before locks were reliable. Grain mills relied on dust sweepers, whose role was to remove explosive flour dust from beams and floors, knowing a single spark could kill dozens instantly. Even writing created odd labor, as ink mixers blended soot, bile, and wine daily, adjusting formulas by instinct rather than measurement, while parchment stretchers pulled animal skins into usable pages with raw strength and patience. In plague-prone regions, air testers burned herbs and observed smoke behavior to judge whether an area was safe, decisions that could empty or repopulate entire streets overnight. The fear of theft extended to grave candles, leading to candle guards who protected church lights, believed to hold spiritual power. Seasonal hunger created official soup stirrers in communal kitchens, tasked with constant motion to prevent burning and ensure fairness, sometimes stirring for hours without rest. In feudal systems, oath recorders memorized vows between lords and peasants, serving as human contracts in societies where paper was rare and literacy limited. Even silence was exploited during punishment, with execution silencers stationed to suppress crowd sympathy or protest before it spread. Rural superstition supported crop whisperers who spoke prayers or chants while planting seeds, believed to improve yield, blending belief and agriculture into one role. At city walls, corpse identifiers examined bodies after attacks or accidents to confirm identity through scars or clothing, settling disputes before burial. Inns employed rumor filters who listened to travelers' stories and decided what information should be passed to authorities, quietly shaping political awareness. Children again filled grim niches, crawling beneath raised floors to retrieve lost coins or tools, valued because they were replaceable. In rivers, body snaggers used hooks to recover drowned victims, an occupation both feared and necessary, as unrecovered bodies were thought to anger spirits. Even laughter was regulated, with festival laugh starters hired to energize crowds during fairs, ensuring spending and celebration continued. What all these jobs share is not absurdity but exposure. They reveal a society where nothing was abstracted away, where every weakness, cold, fear, noise, hunger, belief, had to be managed directly by human hands and bodies. Medieval life produced work, not out of creativity but compulsion, forcing people to occupy roles that absorbed risk, discomfort, and danger so communities could continue functioning. These occupations sound invented because modern systems hide their equivalents behind machines, laws, and institutions. But in the medieval world, survival was visible, personal, and relentless. Every strange job was proof of adaptation, of people bending themselves to fill gaps in a harsh reality, reminding us that history's most unbelievable details are often the most honest reflections of how humans endured a world that offered little mercy and no shortcuts. Even at the furthest edges of medieval existence, labor continued to form wherever fear, ritual, or inconvenience appeared, no matter how small. Some communities relied on official path clearers, whose only responsibility was to remove mud, dung, and refuse from narrow walkways, so nobles and clergy could pass without soiling their clothes, turning cleanliness into a class-based service. In towns near forests, wood listeners pressed their ears to trees and ground to detect illegal logging or movement by enemies, trusting sound more than sight. The management of animals extended into unsettling territory, with carcass testers who inspected dead livestock to determine whether the meat could still be sold cheaply to the poor without provoking riots. Even laughter and joy were monetized through song starters hired to begin hymns or tavern chants so others would follow, preventing awkward silence that was believed to invite bad luck. In households obsessed with lineage, birth witnesses were summoned to confirm a child's legitimacy, watching deliveries closely because inheritance and power depended on their testimony. Fear of hidden disease created skin checkers who examined servants and soldiers for rashes, sores, or swelling, often dismissing people from service based on instinct alone. Medieval kitchens employed spit turners, sometimes animals or children, who rotated roasting meat for hours in intense heat, a monotonous and exhausting role that sustained feasts and status. In monasteries, time counters tracked prayers by counting beads or breaths to ensure divine obligations were fulfilled, precisely turning devotion into measurable labor. The need for spectacle created execution stage builders who assembled platforms quickly in public squares, knowing crowds could turn violent if delays occurred. In river crossings, rope holders stabilized ferries with raw strength, standing knee-deep in freezing water for hours, even when it seemed that every corner of medieval life had already been assigned to someone. New forms of labor continued to emerge, simply because uncertainty never disappeared. Some towns maintained official rumor weighers, whose role was to judge whether stories spreading through markets were harmless gossip or dangerous misinformation, deciding when authorities should intervene before panic erupted. Alongside them were oath-remind fayers, who followed legal proceedings and publicly corrected anyone who misstated vows or agreements, because memory itself was fragile, and mistakes could unravel entire contracts. In large households, shadow servants worked only at night, cleaning, repairing, and rearranging spaces, so nobles would never see labor happening, reinforcing the illusion that comfort existed without effort. Fear of spiritual imbalance created threshold sitters who occupied doorways during births, deaths, or illnesses, believing their presence blocked harmful forces from crossing inside. In river cities, water tasters sampled wells daily to detect bitterness or foulness, relying on experience rather than science to prevent mass poisoning. Even sound required management, with echo breakers hanging cloth or greenery in halls to soften acoustics so sermons and announcements could be understood. In markets crowded with animals, dung markers identified where manure piles lay so carts and pedestrians could avoid slipping, a small but vital task in cities where injuries could mean death. In times of famine, portion cutters measured bread and stew, precisely absorbing the anger of crowds who blamed them for hunger rather than authorities. The fear of impersonation produced seal watchers who guarded official stamps and wax, knowing forged marks could start wars or bankrupt guilds. In monasteries, breath counters monitored chanting monks to ensure rhythm and unity, believing uneven breathing reflected spiritual disorder. Even darkness had its caretakers, with lampwalkers carrying flames through streets to reignite household fires after storms extinguished them. In rural life, hedge binders wove living fences by hand, shaping plants over years to control animals and mark ownership. The handling of violence created blood washers, who cleaned streets after fights or executions before dawn, erasing visible disorder so life could resume by morning. Inns employed wake testers who checked sleeping guests for breath, as deaths in shared rooms could bring legal and spiritual consequences. During festivals, crowd shapers subtly redirected movement, using ropes, poles and bodies to prevent stampedes, often injured themselves to save others. Even time was enforced through bell counters, who ensured signals were neither early nor late, because prayer, work and rest depended on shared rhythm. In courts, gesture readers interpreted posture and eye movement during testimony, offering opinions that could sway verdicts as much as words. The fear of scarcity produced container inspectors, who checked grain sacks, barrels, and jars for hidden compartments, turning suspicion into a profession. In religious life, miracle verifiers examined claims of healing or divine signs, deciding which stories could be promoted and which suppressed to maintain credibility. Even laughter during hardship was structured, with festival calmers stepping in when joy became too wild and risked violence. Children continued to serve as living tools, slipping into collapsed structures to retrieve goods or bodies adults could not reach. At the edges of society, exile guides escorted banished individuals beyond town limits, ensuring they left and never returned, absorbing the emotional weight of separation. Every one of these roles existed because medieval society lacked distance between problem and response. Nothing was abstract, nothing automatic. Every inconvenience, fear, or danger demanded a human presence to absorb it. These jobs sound unreal today because they expose survival in its rawest form, where life functioned only because people stood in the gap between chaos and order. Medieval work was not about innovation or fulfillment, but about endurance, about assigning flesh and voice to every vulnerability so communities could persist. The sheer accumulation of these forgotten occupations reveals a world constantly on the edge, held together not by comfort or progress, but by countless individuals performing strange, exhausting, and often thankless tasks, so that ordinary life, however fragile, could continue one more uncertain day. Even at this point, medieval life still refused to leave any space unmanaged, and so labour kept multiplying wherever fragility appeared. Some towns relied on official stairkeepers, whose duty was to watch accused criminals or suspected witches without blinking for long periods, believing guilt revealed itself through involuntary movement or fear. Alongside them were patience testers, who deliberately delayed legal decisions or market exchanges to observe how people reacted under stress, using behaviour as evidence of intent or character. In crowded cities, walltapers moved through alleyways smoothing sharp stone edges with tools or cloth, to reduce injuries in darkness, a quiet job that prevented countless infections. Fear of spiritual intrusion created bed blessers who visited homes after illness or death, praying over sleeping spaces to prevent nightmares, madness, or possession. In noble households, silence walkers padded through corridors, at night ensuring no floorboard creaked, fixing noises immediately because sound was associated with danger and vulnerability. Even heat had specialists, with half listeners adjusting fires by sound rather than sight, knowing that too much heat could crack stone or ignite beams. The medieval obsession with order extended into motion itself, producing pace-setters who walked at the front of processions to control speed, preventing disorder or disrespect towards sacred symbols. In rural communities, dew watchers rose before sunrise to observe moisture on crops, reporting conditions that guided planting and harvesting decisions long before meteorology existed. Children were again used where adults feared injury, crawling inside large bells to clean and repair them, risking falls so timekeeping and worship could continue. In ports, salt scrapers gathered crystallized salt from docks and boats, an essential resource for food preservation that required constant attention. The handling of fear created bravery demonstrators, individuals sent first into unknown spaces like abandoned buildings or plague houses, proving safety through survival rather than evidence. In marketplaces, fairness callers announced prices allowed to prevent secret bargaining, absorbing anger from both buyers and sellers when disputes arose. Medieval belief in balance created pain equalizers who adjusted punishment so offenders of similar crimes suffered equally, ensuring justice looked consistent even when bodies differed. In monasteries, weight counters ensured monks slept only the permitted hours, waking them gently or harshly depending on rank. Inns employed story silencers who interrupted tales that might provoke fear of plague, war or famine among travellers, controlling emotion as a form of crowd management. Even stone had its caretakers, with crack markers painting symbols on walls where weakness appeared, tracking decay over generations. In times of drought, well guards prevented desperate overuse of water sources, standing between survival and violence. The dead continued to shape labour through bone counters, who tracked remains moved into charnel houses, ensuring prayers matched the number of souls believed present. In courts, truth provokers asked deliberately confusing or offensive questions to elicit spontaneous reactions. Trusting instinct over logic, seasonal labour created leaf sweepers who removed wet foliage from streets to prevent rot and slipping, a task as monotonous as it was vital. Medieval society even employed hope keepers, individuals known for speaking calmly and confidently during disasters, believed to prevent panic simply through tone and presence. Every one of these occupations existed because medieval life offered no buffer between danger and response. Every risk required a human body to stand in front of it. What makes these jobs feel unreal is how exposed they are, how openly they reveal fear, fragility, and inequality as normal conditions of existence. Yet, for the people who performed them, these roles were not strange. They were survival, identity, and duty. The medieval world did not hide its mechanisms. It lived inside them, assigning watchful eyes, listening ears, steady hands, and enduring bodies to every weakness in society. In doing so, it reminds us that history was not sustained by grand events alone, but by an endless accumulation of small, strange, and exhausting jobs that kept chaos at bay for one more uncertain day. Even now, the medieval world still seems unwilling to run out of strange labour, because uncertainty itself kept generating work. Some communities relied on official hesitation watchers, who observed moments when people paused before answering questions, believing truth revealed itself in instinctive delays rather than words. In the same spaces existed gesture correctors who subtly adjusted how accused individuals stood or faced judges, ensuring proceedings appeared orderly and divinely sanctioned. In cities plagued by drafts and illness, air blockers stuffed cloth, moss, or leather into wall gaps seasonally, crawling through narrow spaces that scraped skin raw. Fear of contamination created spoon guards at communal meals, whose only task was to ensure no utensil touched the ground or another mouth improperly, as shared eating carried both social and mortal risk. Even children's play was managed through stick gatherers who removed sharp debris from streets. Even after tracing all these layers, medieval society still appears endlessly inventive in how it assigned human beings to absorb uncertainty. Some towns employed official line holders during distributions of food or alms, people whose only task was to keep bodies aligned and prevent surges that could turn hunger into deadly crushes. In the same spaces were fairness witnesses who memorized who arrived first, last, or not at all, because accusations of favoritism could spark riots. Fear of bad fortune produced object turners who rotated tools, icons, or household items after misfortune struck, believing stagnation attracted further disaster. In cities built on slopes, slip testers walked streets after rain, deliberately stepping on stones to identify dangerous patches before carts and horses passed. Even breath itself became monitored through winter cough listeners, who tracked patterns of illness spreading by sound alone, reporting concerns before symptoms were visible. In noble households, presence fillers stood silently during meetings or meals to ensure rooms never felt empty, as emptiness was associated with vulnerability or ill omen in agricultural life. Seed blessers travelled field to field murmuring prayers while scattering grain, paid not for results but for reassurance. Children were again used as living instruments, lowered into wells with ropes to test air quality before adults descended, their survival serving as proof rather than science. In ports, tide touchers dipped hands or feet into water repeatedly through the day to sense changes in temperature and pull, guiding docking decisions without charts. Fear of violence created weapon watchers who stood near armories ensuring blades were returned properly, knowing missing weapons meant bloodshed later. In monasteries, silence counters tracked accidental words spoken during vows, assigning penance proportionally, turning even mistakes into measurable labour. In markets, scent scatterers threw herbs or ashes to neutralise smells that signalled decay and panic, understanding that fear often travelled faster than disease itself. Even celebration had limits, with joybreakers intervening when festivals grew too wild, cutting music or extinguishing fires before excitement turned into chaos. In courts, truth holders physically stood between accuser and accused, symbolizing balance and restraint, absorbing aggression through posture alone. In river towns, fog callers used horns or bells during heavy mist to prevent collisions, their lungs acting as navigation tools. During droughts, well listeners dropped stones to judge water depth by sound, deciding who could draw and who must wait. The medieval world also employed memory carriers for songs, prayers, and laws. Individuals valued not for strength or wealth, but for the reliability of their recall in cultures where forgetting could destroy continuity. Even shame was organized, with guilt escorts guiding offenders through public spaces. At controlled speeds, so humiliation was visible, but not fatal. At the edges of towns, farewell watchers ensured travellers truly left before gates closed, preventing return under cover of darkness. In hospitals, breath counters judged whether the dying had truly passed, delaying burial until sound, warmth, and movement ceased beyond doubt. Every one of these roles existed because medieval life had no insulation from risk. There were no safety nets, no quiet systems working unseen. Everything relied on presence, attention, and endurance. These jobs sound unreal because they expose survival without filters, where every fear required a person to stand in front of it, and every mistake carried immediate consequence. Medieval society functioned not through efficiency but through saturation, assigning human bodies to every fragile point where order might fail. When viewed as a whole, this endless web of strange occupations reveals a civilization held together not by comfort or progress, but by countless individuals performing narrow, exhausting, and often invisible tasks, day after day, so that life could continue despite hunger, superstition, danger, and death pressing constantly at the edges. Even now, it feels as though medieval society never truly ran out of ways to transform vulnerability into work, because every moment of life carried risk that had to be managed by someone. Some towns appointed official loiter counters, who monitored how long people stood in one place, believing extended stillness signaled plotting, theft, or witchcraft rather than rest. Alongside them were movement nudgers, who subtly encouraged crowds to keep flowing through streets, so congestion did not invite crime, disease, or panic. Fear of decay created rot sniffers, who inspected wooden beams, barrels, and floors by scent alone, identifying danger long before collapse or contamination became visible. In households, sleep arrangers decided who slept where each night to balance warmth, safety, and hierarchy, knowing that a wrong placement could mean illness or assault. The medieval concern with transitions produced dawn callers, who walked streets at first light announcing the day, believed to chase away spirits that lingered after night. Even mirrors of water were managed through reflection breakers, who disturbed still surfaces after deaths or crimes, fearing souls could become trapped if reflections remained undisturbed. In cities with narrow lanes, shoulder guides walked beside carts to prevent loads from scraping walls and showering pedestrians with debris. Markets relied on fairness touchers who handled goods publicly, so buyers could see texture and weight, building trust through physical contact rather than certification. In times of unrest, calm walkers moved slowly through crowds speaking ordinary phrases, trained to reduce agitation simply by modeling steadiness. The obsession with signs extended to crack listeners who placed ears against walls during storms, listening for shifts that might foretell collapse or divine warning. In monasteries, light counters ensured candles burned evenly, so prayers aligned across hours, turning illumination into synchronized labor. Even loneliness became structured, with companion sitters paid to remain with the elderly or dying, so no one passed alone, as solitary death was believed to disturb both soul and community. In ports, rope dryers monitored wet lines to prevent rot spreading and gathering them repeatedly under changing skies. Children again bore invisible danger, sent as crawl watchers beneath raised floors to ensure fires had not spread unnoticed. In courts, pause fillers spoke ritual phrases when silence grew too long, preventing discomfort from being interpreted as guilt or doubt. Agricultural superstition created night field walkers who circled crops after planting, guarding against animals, thieves, and unseen forces alike. Even hunger sounds were managed, with stomach quieters distributing watered broth during shortages to reduce the noise of distress that could incite revolt. In religious life, tear counters measured grief at funerals, ensuring mourning appeared sufficient but not excessive, balancing social expectation with control. Inns employed room breathers who opened and closed shutters at specific intervals to refresh air, believed to carry illness. The dead continued to generate labor through grave warmth testers who placed hands on soil days after burial, watching for signs of mistaken death. Every one of these roles existed because medieval life allowed no abstraction, no distance between fear and response. Problems were not solved by systems, but by people standing close, watching, listening, touching, and enduring. These jobs sound unreal because they expose survival stripped of modern buffers, where even silence, movement, smell, and emotion required management. Medieval society survived not by eliminating danger, but by distributing it across countless human bodies, each assigned a narrow task that absorbed a fragment of risk. When all these forgotten occupations are viewed together, they form a relentless mosaic of adaptation, showing a world held together, not by comfort or certainty, but by continuous human presence. People positioned everywhere, life might break, quietly preventing collapse one small, strange duty at a time. Even beyond all of this, medieval life continued to fracture responsibility into ever smaller pieces, because insecurity never rested. Some towns relied on official glance-keepers who observed eye contact during disputes, believing truth and submission could be measured by who looked away first. Alongside them were posture judges who evaluated how accused individuals stood, slouched, or shifted weight, interpreting body language as moral evidence in a world with little forensic proof. In dense neighborhoods, corner listeners stood at street bends at night, trained to recognize footsteps and breathing patterns to distinguish locals from strangers. Fear of spoilage produced barrel turners who rotated stored food and drink daily, so sediment and rot would not settle unevenly, preserving supplies through motion alone. In castles, draft feelers ran bare hands along walls during winter to locate invisible cold leaks, guiding repairs long before insulation existed. Even dust had caretakers with powder sweepers removing fine debris from shelves and beams to prevent coughing fits believed to weaken the soul. In monasteries, word counters tracked how often monks repeated prayers, ensuring devotion did not become careless through habit. Children once again filled the most perilous gaps, serving as bell testers who rang newly repaired bells, while others watched from below, trusting small bodies to test danger first. In ports, wave measurers marked how high water splashed against stone at different times of day, recording patterns by memory rather than instruments. In markets, argument listeners positioned themselves near loud voice. Even after imagining all these roles, the medieval world still feels inexhaustible in how it converted anxiety into obligation, because life itself was a constant negotiation with danger. Some towns appointed official waiting watchers, whose task was simply to stand near gates, courts, or markets, and observe how long people waited, believing impatience revealed guilt, desperation, or intent to deceive. Alongside them were breath pause counters who noted irregular breathing during questioning, convinced that truth altered the body before words did. In crowded quarters, stair listeners sat on landings at night, memorizing the rhythm of steps so unfamiliar patterns could be detected instantly. Fear of decay produced clotharers, who constantly moved tapestries and hangings to prevent dampness, mold and illness, turning motion into preservation. In households, bed warmth testers checked sleeping spaces before use, ensuring previous occupants had not left behind sickness or misfortune. Medieval concern with endings created farewell speakers, whose only duty was to utter the correct words when someone left town, died, or was banished, because silence was thought to invite bad luck. In cities plagued by smoke, chimney watchers scanned rooftops all day, reading the color and shape of smoke plumes to detect danger before flames appeared. Even water crossings required trust placed in rope testers who leaned their full weight on bridges and ferries each morning, offering their bodies as proof of safety. In markets, honesty mirrors were polished metal plates, placed behind sellers, with attendants ensuring buyers could see reflections of hands and scales, reinforcing trust through visibility rather than law. Children were again placed where adults hesitated, serving as tunnel feelers, who crawled through collapsed drains or passages to judge whether rescue or retrieval was possible. In monasteries, step counters tracked monks' movements to ensure discipline, believing excess wandering weakened spiritual focus. Fear of bad nights created dream breakers who woke sleepers gently if they thrashed or cried, believing unchecked nightmares could spill into waking madness. In ports, knot loosers specialized in freeing ropes seized tight by salt and weather, a task demanding patience and strength rather than tools. Even silence during meals was controlled, with chew listeners trained to hear choking before it became fatal. In times of unrest, rumor dampeners quietly contradicted exaggerated stories in taverns, using calm repetition rather than authority to soften fear. The medieval world even employed apology receivers, individuals whose role was to accept blame publicly, so anger could be discharged without violence. In rural life, frostwalkers tested ground hardness before ploughing, preventing broken tools and injured animals. Religious belief created vigil breathers who stayed awake beside relics to ensure candles never extinguished, believing darkness invited catastrophe. The dead continued to shape work through soil scent testers who smelled freshly turned earth for signs of decay that might attract animals or suggest unrest. Even joy required regulation, with laughter counters ensuring celebrations did not tip into mockery of authority or sacred symbols. Each of these occupations existed because medieval life had no abstraction layer. There was no distance between risk and response. Everything depended on presence, sensation, memory, and endurance. These jobs sound unreal today because modern life hides equivalents behind systems, laws, and machines, allowing danger to feel distant and managed. In the medieval world, danger was immediate and personal, and survival meant assigning human beings to stand directly in front of uncertainty. The result was a society held together, not by comfort or efficiency, but by an endless network of people performing narrow, exhausting, and often invisible tasks, each one absorbing a small piece of chaos so that life could continue, fragile but unbroken. For one more day, even after all these layers, medieval life still found ways to turn the most fleeting risks into permanent responsibilities, because nothing was considered too small to ignore. Some towns relied on official linger watchers who noted who stayed too long near gates, wells, or granaries, believing hesitation near essential resources hinted at theft or sabotage. Alongside them were glance redirectors, who physically shifted people's attention during tense moments, preventing staring contests from escalating into violence. In narrow houses, ceiling sweepers climbed beams weekly to remove cobwebs and soot, not only for cleanliness, but because falling debris was believed to invite illness or bad spirits. Fear of sickness produced breath matchers who compared the smell and warmth of breath between family members, warning households when imbalance suggested disease. In monasteries, page-turners assisted readers during long prayers or study, preventing fatigue from interrupting sacred rhythm. Even water storage created odd labour, with barrel listeners tapping casks daily to hear changes in tone that indicated leaks or spoilage. Children again filled liminal roles, sent as floor listeners to lie flat and detect vibrations from carts or crowds approaching, acting as early warning systems. In markets, fairness shadows followed inspectors quietly, confirming that judgments were consistent and not corrupted by bribes. The obsession with order extended to eating itself, producing bite counters who ensured equal portions during communal meals to prevent resentment. In ports, rope warmers handled frozen lines in winter, restoring flexibility with hands and body heat alone. Fear of nighttime danger created lamp followers who walked behind torchbearers to relight flames if wind extinguished them, ensuring darkness never fully took hold. In courts, truth silencers intervened when testimony became too emotional, stopping speech before passion undermined authority. Rural superstition supported path blessers who marked roads after accidents so travellers would not repeat misfortune. Even waste had guardians, with ash collectors gathering hearth remains before dawn because stale ash was thought to attract sickness. In inns, snore listeners identified guests whose breathing suggested distress, illness, or death, waking them before tragedy occurred. Medieval anxiety about balance created load equalizers who shifted goods on carts to prevent uneven strain that might snap axles or injure animals. Religious festivals required crowd breathers who created space around fainting worshippers so panic would not spread. In famine seasons, rumour swallowers publicly admitted fear or greed to absorb anger meant for leaders, acting as emotional shields. Even walls were monitored by moisture touchers who ran fingers along stone after rain, mapping dampness over years to predict collapse. In households of power, presence counters ensured the correct number of attendants surrounded nobles at all times, as being alone signalled weakness. The dead continued to dictate work through bone aligners who rearranged remains, so graves lay properly, believed to preserve peace between the living and the departed. During celebrations, fire whisperers adjusted flames gently rather than abruptly, believing sudden change angered both people and spirits. What becomes undeniable through all these examples is that medieval society survived, not through abstraction or efficiency, but through relentless human allocation. Every fear, every inconvenience, every unknown was assigned to a body, a role, a routine. These jobs sound unreal today because modern life has buried their equivalents under systems that hide labour and soften danger. In the medieval world, survival was visible, tactile and exhausting, and work was simply whatever stood between order and collapse. The sheer abundance of these forgotten occupations reveals a civilization that endured not by eliminating hardship, but by spreading it across countless people, each performing a small, strange duty so that life, fragile and uncertain, could continue one more day. Even at this depth, medieval society still seems incapable of leaving uncertainty unmanaged, because survival demanded constant human intervention. Some towns appointed official delay fillers, whose role was to speak neutral phrases or prayers during moments of uncertainty, so silence would not provoke fear or suspicion. Alongside them were suspicion diffusers, who casually engaged tense individuals in harmless conversation, breaking confrontations before they ignited into violence. In tightly packed neighborhoods, wall feelers ran hands along shared walls at night to detect heat changes that signaled hidden fires before smoke appeared. Fear of illness created saliva watchers who discreetly observed spitting habits, believing changes in saliva revealed disease before fever struck. In monasteries, footstep counters tracked how often monks moved during hours of contemplation, correcting behavior through observation rather than punishment. Even livestock anxiety generated work, with animal breath listeners placing ears close to noses and mouths to detect sickness before symptoms became visible. Children again bore invisible responsibility as crawl testers sent into grain bins to check for rot, collapse, or vermin, their survival treated as confirmation of safety. In markets, touch validators handled goods publicly after inspection, so buyers trusted quality through shared contact rather than authority. In ports, tide scent readers judged approaching weather by smell alone, sensing storms before clouds appeared. The fear of divine displeasure produced altar dusters who removed debris with precise motions, believing careless cleaning could invite punishment. Inns relied on sleep shifters who gently repositioned guests at night to prevent suffocation or hypothermia in shared beds. Even at the very edge of what feels imaginable, medieval society still kept assigning human beings to absorb uncertainty, because nothing about life was ever fully secure. Some towns maintained official hesitation breakers, whose role was to interrupt moments when crowds or councils fell into uneasy silence, filling the air with routine phrases so doubt would not grow into fear. Alongside them were tension walkers, who slowly paced through heated gatherings, believed to drain aggression simply by their calm movement and steady presence. In cramped dwellings, roof listeners pressed ears to rafters during storms, trained to distinguish normal strain from the sounds of imminent collapse. Fear of sickness created tongue watchers who discreetly observed changes in speech clarity, believing illness first revealed itself through slurred or slowed words. In monasteries, breath synchronizers ensured collective chanting rose and fell together, correcting individuals whose rhythm drifted, because disorder in sound was thought to reflect disorder in faith. Children were again placed where adults hesitated, lowered into storage pits or abandoned rooms with ropes to test safety before others followed. In marketplaces, fairness reflectors repeated prices and measures aloud, so no single voice controlled the narrative of trade. In ports, rope-scent judges smelled damp fibers to predict rot long before breakage occurred. The obsession with boundaries produced shadow measurers who tracked how far a person's shadow crossed into forbidden spaces, using light itself as evidence of trespass. Inns employed dream quieters who soothed guests waking in terror, believing panic could spread through shared rooms like disease. In courts, truth-steadiness testers asked the same question days apart, comparing tone and posture rather than words. Rural superstition created frost feelers who touched soil before dawn, judging whether crops would survive the night. Even joy was regulated, with festival slowers gradually reducing music and movement to prevent celebrations from ending in exhaustion or violence. In hospitals, groan counters tracked changes in suffering over hours, using sound as a crude measure of life's persistence. The dead continued to demand vigilance through earth-sent readers, who monitored graves for signs of decay that might attract animals or fear among the living. In noble households, presence shapers arranged attendants to project strength or humility, depending on circumstance, turning human arrangement into political messaging. Even tools had guardians, with blade listeners tapping metal lightly to hear hidden cracks before use. During droughts, water fairness callers announced turn, taking loudly, so no one felt secretly cheated. The medieval world even employed calm inheritors, elders supported specifically because their composure during past disasters made others trust them instinctively. What all of this reveals is a society that survived not by eliminating danger, but by confronting it openly and continuously. Every uncertainty became a task, every risk a role, every fear a job assigned to someone's senses, memory, or endurance. These occupations sound unbelievable today, because modern life hides their equivalents behind systems, technology, and distance. In the medieval world, nothing was hidden. Survival was personal, immediate, and exhausting, maintained by countless people standing watch at every weak point of existence. When all these forgotten roles are taken together, they form not a fantasy, but a stark truth. Medieval life endured because human beings were endlessly willing, or forced, to become the living mechanisms that kept chaos from rushing in, holding the fragile structure of everyday life together, one small, strange responsibility at a time. Even after all this, medieval life still seems incapable of leaving a single uncertainty unattended, because the world people lived in was constantly threatening to break apart. Some towns relied on official hesitation smoothers, whose job was to step into moments when arguments stalled, offering neutral observations so disputes did not harden into violence. Alongside them were suspicion absorbers, who willingly drew accusations onto themselves, allowing anger to discharge without destroying more valuable members of society. In tightly packed streets, wall-warmth readers pressed palms against stone at different hours, mapping heat changes that could reveal hidden fires, illness, or overcrowding. Fear of sickness created breath temperature feelers, who judged fever simply by standing close, since thermometers did not exist and touch carried authority. In monasteries, page aligners ensured books rested at precise angles during reading, because misalignment was believed to weaken concentration and invite distraction from devotion. Children were again placed where adults feared consequence, serving as crawl scouts sent under collapsed roofs or unstable floors, their survival treated as proof of safety rather than evidence. In markets, fairness echoers repeated transactions aloud, so the sound of agreement itself became a binding force. In ports, tide pulse listeners placed hands in water to feel subtle vibrations that warned of distant storms or approaching ships before they were visible. The fear of moral decay produced laughter dampeners who intervened when humour became mocking or excessive, protecting authority and social order through restraint. Inns employed sleep counters who tracked how long guests remained unconscious, believing unnatural stillness meant death or danger. In courts, voice steadiness judges evaluated whether tones rose or fell under pressure, treating vocal control as a sign of truth. Agricultural superstition created soil warmth testers who knelt barefoot at dawn to sense whether planting should begin. Trusting bodies more than calendars. Even darkness required labour, with shadow dispersers disturbing corners of rooms believed to harbour lingering misfortune after illness or conflict. The dead continued to shape work through grave pressure watchers who revisited burial sites after rain to ensure the earth had not shifted in troubling ways. In noble households, silence calibrators decided when quiet conveyed dignity and when it suggested weakness, shaping power through absence of sound. Tools demanded vigilance as well, with handle listeners tapping wood for hollow notes that hinted at imminent breakage. During famine, anger walkers moved deliberately through crowds, absorbing curses and threats meant for rulers, protecting authority through personal risk. The medieval world even formalized calm itself, supporting individuals known for steady behavior during past disasters, relying on their presence to prevent panic from spreading. What becomes overwhelming is not how strange these jobs sound, but how necessary they were in a world without buffers, measurements, or systems to absorb failure. Every danger was immediate, every mistake visible, every solution human. These roles feel unreal now because modern life has hidden their descendants behind technology, bureaucracy, and distance. In the medieval world, survival was exposed and intimate, maintained by countless people assigned to stand between order and collapse. Each strange occupation was a small human wall built against chaos, and together they formed a society that endured not through comfort or certainty, but through relentless attention, endurance, and the willingness to turn even fear itself into work, so life could continue, fragile yet unbroken, for one more day. Even still, medieval society never seemed to exhaust its capacity to turn unease into obligation, because daily life demanded constant vigilance against forces people barely understood. Some towns appointed official hesitation fillers who stood near courts or councils and spoke ritual phrases whenever silence grew uncomfortable, believing pauses allowed doubt or rebellion to take root. Alongside them were emotion readers who watched faces in crowds for early signs of anger or despair, quietly alerting authorities before unrest erupted. In cramped homes, ceiling tap listeners used knuckles or tools to check beams for weakness after storms, relying on sound to prevent sudden collapse. Fear of illness created sweat watchers who observed dampness on skin during labor, judging whether fatigue or sickness threatened a worker's life. In monasteries, chant correctors adjusted pitch and pace mid-prayer, so voices blended into a single sound as harmony was believed to mirror divine order. Children were again placed at the threshold of danger, sent into smoke, filled rooms to judge whether fires still burned unseen, their survival treated as confirmation rather than tragedy. In marketplaces, trust binders tied knots or marks during agreements, so memory and material signaled honesty together. In ports, fog listeners strained to hear bells or waves through mist, guiding ships by sound when sight failed completely. Fear of divine displeasure created altar symmetry keepers, who adjusted candles and objects repeatedly, so imbalance would not invite punishment. Inns relied on night breath checkers who moved from bed to bed listening for irregular breathing, ensuring death did not arrive unnoticed among sleeping strangers. In courts, reaction provers deliberately interrupted testimony to observe instinctive responses, trusting reflex over reason. Rural superstition produced frost warders who walked fields at night striking the ground with sticks, believing noise could scare cold away from crops. Even celebration required discipline, with festival quieters stepping in when joy turned reckless, slowing music and extinguishing fires before accidents followed. In hospitals, pain-tone judges distinguished cries of fear from cries of physical suffering, deciding when restraint, prayer, or care was required. The dead continued to demand labor through soil, even at this seemingly impossible depth. Medieval life still produced work wherever uncertainty lingered, because nothing about existence could ever be taken for granted. Some towns relied on official doubt coolers, whose role was to speak calmly when accusations escalated too quickly, slowing judgment so violence did not erupt before authority could respond. Alongside them were presence anchors, individuals positioned deliberately in tense spaces, simply because their known temperament reassured others, turning personality itself into public infrastructure. In dense housing, floor heat readers lay flat at night, sensing warmth through planks, detecting hidden fires, illness, or overcrowding before danger surfaced. Fear of sickness created voice texture listeners who noticed hoarseness or weakness in speech, believing disease announced itself through sound before the body failed. In monasteries, pause regulators ensured silence between prayers lasted neither too long nor too short, as improper timing was thought to weaken spiritual protection. Children again occupied the narrowest margins of safety, sent ahead into smoke, water, or unstable ground, because their small size made danger easier to test and loss easier to justify. In markets, trust witnesses stood near exchanges, committing details to memory so disputes could later be settled without written proof. In ports, rope tension feelers ran hands along lines at dawn, sensing strain that could snap under load hours later. Fear of moral disorder created laughter judges who decided whether humor crossed into disrespect, curbing social collapse through tone rather than punishment. Inns employed wait confirmers who returned repeatedly to sleeping guests, watching for breath, movement, or warmth, because unnoticed death carried legal and spiritual consequences. In courts, tone mirrorers repeated statements back to speakers, watching whether confidence faltered when words were echoed. Agricultural superstition produced soil sounders who struck earth lightly to judge hollowness, moisture, or hidden pests before planting. Even darkness demanded management, with corner disturbers sweeping unseen spaces after tragedy to ensure nothing lingered unseen. The dead continued to require vigilance through earth settle watchers who revisited graves weeks later, smoothing shifts that might provoke fear or rumor. In noble households, silence composers decided when quiet conveyed dignity and when it implied weakness, shaping authority without words. Tools were protected by handle balancers, who redistributed weight on worn grips to prevent sudden failure mid-task. During shortages, anger diffusers walked openly among crowds, allowing insults and blame to land on them rather than leaders, absorbing social pressure through personal risk. The medieval world even formalized reassurance, supporting individuals known for calm speech and steady posture during disasters, trusting familiarity more than logic. What becomes unmistakable is that medieval survival was never passive. Every moment required human attention, and every weakness demanded a body to stand in front of it. These jobs feel unbelievable today because modern life has buried their equivalents beneath layers of technology, policy, and abstraction. In the medieval world, nothing was abstract. Survival was immediate, visible, and shared, sustained by countless people performing narrow, strange, and exhausting tasks that absorbed fear, danger, and uncertainty piece by piece. When taken together, these forgotten occupations reveal a society not defined by superstition or ignorance, but by relentless adaptation, a world that endured by turning every threat into work, every fear into duty, and every fragile moment into a responsibility. Someone had to carry so life could continue, uncertain but unbroken, for one more day. Even beyond this, medieval life continued to fracture responsibility into ever finer pieces, because uncertainty never truly slept. Some towns employed official moment watchers whose sole task was to observe the instant before decisions were made, believing truth or deceit, lived in hesitation rather than speech. Alongside them were calm imitators who deliberately mirrored relaxed posture and breathing intense spaces, trusting that emotions could be guided through imitation rather than force. In crowded housing, beam dust listeners tapped ceilings lightly each morning, listening for subtle changes in sound that warned of rot or collapse before it became visible. Fear of sickness created skin warmth judges who hovered hands near bodies to sense imbalance, relying on experience rather than measurement. In monasteries, rhythm keepers tracked the pace of daily movement, walking, eating, praying, ensuring no action became rushed or sluggish. As imbalance was thought to invite temptation or error, children were again placed where adults feared consequence, sent into narrow chimneys or tunnels, not only to clean but to confirm structural safety, their survival treated as reassurance rather than risk. In markets, honesty callers repeated agreements, loudly at the moment of exchange, so memory, sound, and witnesses fused into binding truth. In ports, tide breath readers inhaled deeply near water at dawn and dusk, convinced changes in smell and air pressure signaled storms before clouds formed. Fear of disrespect created eye. Level adjusters who ensured people of different ranks did not meet gazes too long or too briefly, regulating power through eye contact alone. Inns relied on night warmth checkers who felt blankets and bodies to prevent guests from slipping into fatal cold unnoticed. In courts, reaction silencers intervened when emotional responses threatened to sway judgment too strongly, restoring order through interruption rather than argument. Agricultural superstition produced seed silence keepers who demanded quiet during planting, believing noise disturbed the earth's willingness to give. Even darkness was organized, with shadow measurers judging how far torchlight reached, so no corner remained fully unseen. The dead continued to shape labor through bone quieters, who rearranged remains gently to prevent sounds believed to disturb both spirits and mourners. In noble households, presence designers arranged servants and guards, not for function alone, but to project reassurance, intimidation, or mercy, depending on circumstance. Tools demanded constant care from grip listeners who detected fatigue in wood and leather by feel alone. During shortages, blame carriers publicly accepted anger and curses, meant for authorities, acting as human lightning rods for social tension. The medieval world even recognized emotional endurance as labor, supporting individuals known for patience, steadiness, and quiet authority during repeated crises. What this endless accumulation reveals is not exaggeration, but exposure. Medieval survival required constant human mediation. Nothing was automatic, nothing distant, nothing safely abstract. Every fear demanded a watcher, every risk a listener, every unknown a body willing to stand in front of it. These jobs feel unreal today because modern life hides their descendants behind systems and machines that quietly absorb danger. In the medieval world, danger was visible and immediate, and survival meant assigning flesh, attention, and endurance to every fragile point. Taken together, these countless strange occupations form a portrait of a society that endured not through comfort or certainty, but through relentless presence. People positioned everywhere. Life might fail, quietly holding it together through narrow, exhausting, and often forgotten acts that allowed the world to continue. One precarious day at a time. Even at this stage, medieval society still appears to generate labour out of the smallest cracks in daily life, because nothing could be left to chance. Some towns relied on official stillness breakers, whose task was to create small, harmless movements in places where silence and immobility lingered too long, since unmoving spaces were believed to attract danger, sickness, or unrest. Alongside them were anxiety readers who observed hands rather than faces, believing trembling fingers revealed fear or deceit before the mind could control expression. In dense housing blocks, floor creak mappers memorized which sounds belonged to which steps, detecting intruders or structural weakness purely through familiarity. Fear of illness produced scent-balanced judges who compared household smells day to day, convinced disease announced itself through subtle changes long before visible symptoms emerged. In monasteries, routine guardians ensured daily tasks occurred in the same order every day, believing disruption of sequence weakened both discipline and divine favour. Children were again placed in roles. Adults avoided, sent to test air in sealed rooms or storage pits by breathing and waiting, their bodies serving as instruments rather than lives to be protected. In marketplaces, trust repeaters quietly echoed prices and agreements under their breath, reinforcing memory and discouraging sudden changes of mind. In ports, hull knockers tapped ship sides, rhythmically judging seaworthiness by resonance rather than inspection. Fear of social imbalance created laughter timing keepers who decided when humour had gone too far and intervened before mockery turned into defiance. Inns relied on night warmth feelers who checked sleeping guests for dangerous cold or unnatural stillness, preventing deaths that could bring legal and spiritual consequences. In courts, contradiction hunters ask questions designed to circle back on themselves, watching where answers frayed under pressure. Agricultural superstition created earth listeners who pressed ears to the ground before ploughing, believing the land communicated readiness through sound and vibration. Even darkness itself had caretakers.